Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dr. Terri Show. I've got Elizebeth DiMeo back in the studio with me today, and we are very passionately debunking a lot of confusing trends right now. Is carnivore better, paleo, Mediterranean, and what about beef tallow and the trend around beef tallow and Steak and Shake's beef tallow fries? That sounds pretty amazing. Join us in the studio and we'll get to the root of these conversations. Welcome back, Elizebeth. Honestly, I really wish the cameras were rolling before we just rolled, because we were having a great conversation that I'm sure we can recreate. But I want to talk, about food. We're always talking about food and nutrition. Obviously, that's your forte. But I got so excited when I saw the news that Steak and Shake is using beef tallow with their French fries. I was like, that's so awesome. And then we find out they're not even really using potatoes, essentially. So I was talking about this on another show about how, we got to really pay attention. We're being so marketed to. It's amazing that they're trying to take a step forward and not use inflammatory seed oils. But tell us about the French fries that they're cooking in beef tallow so people can understand what questions to ask.
I think this is a really good conversation, because I think that we get onto a novelty product. So right now, beef tallow is the thing. Now, there's nothing wrong with beef tallow. Remember, we had that conversation about margarine, and I said during World War I, they used beef tallow mixed with olive oil to make what they called margarine, because they didn't have access to butter or supplies were low. So that's one thing. And there's nothing technically wrong even with beef fat. However, should we be eating beef tallow? It's got 50% saturated fat, a little bit of mono, a little bit of polyunsaturated. I would say it's certainly better than seed oils. So if these restaurants like Steak and Shake want to replace their oils with the tallow, that's great. But here's the sticky wicket, as you just said. The fries that they're getting is not a potato that's sliced. It's got potatoes and then a batter mix of modified food starch, rice flour, corn flour, dextrin, salt, leavening. It's got soda, sodium acid, pyrophosphate, monocalcium phosphate, dextrose and or corn syrup solid, xanthan gum, vegetable oil. So wait a minute. Now all of a sudden we've got seed oils in our potatoes that are now getting fried in beef tallow. Okay. So soybean oil, canola oil, dextrose, and disodium dihydrogen pyrophosphate to maintain natural colors. I mean, come on.
Pronounce those. How did you even roll those off your tongue? So what are they doing? Just mixing all this stuff and then compressing them into a mold that looks like a French fry?
Right. So they get crispy.
Why aren't people just using potatoes?
I don't know. I think they want to get a crispier fry, or what they don't want to do is sit there in the kitchen and mandolin a fry.
But what do the French do? They use potatoes and duck fat, and they're the best French fries ever. I use a lot of duck fat now, more than beef tallow, honestly. It has such a great flavor. It's awesome. So this is a really great conversation, because there's all this, what a brilliant marketing strategy by Steak and Shake.
Right.
We're using beef tallow now. Now, all these people that are health conscious are flocking. And I hate to bust everybody's bubble. And again, to your point, it is better than the same fake French fry made in some big vat of seed oil that's been sitting there. And I'm sure there's probably going to be some controversy down the road with big vats of beef tallow sitting there overnight and breaking down, and it's going to have some sort of toxins, I'm sure, at some point. But it brings us back to this conversation about people understanding how they're being marketed to. I had this conversation with my youngest daughter is very into, like us, she likes to eat healthy and eat like we do, and in trying to educate other family members, it gets kind of maddening, because people are so marketed to and they don't even realize it. I was using this example previously of even beef tallow being marketed as keto friendly, paleo friendly. Of course it is. It's like seeing paleo or keto friendly on an olive oil bottle.
Right.
It's manipulation. It's manipulation, and we see this a lot with kids' food. But I wanted to break down, since we're on this topic, because so many people have questions about, so many people are on this movement with the Maha movement that's happening right now, to find a healthier way of eating. So we've got carnivore diet, we've got paleo, we've got vegan, if you follow the forks over knives way of thinking, and then we've got Mediterranean, of course, which is my favorite, makes the most sense intuitively. But let's kind of break these down a little bit, because and then why do some people lose a lot of weight on one and some people gain weight on the same diet? And just let's just start with the carnivore diet. Big trend right now. And I think there's a lot of people losing weight on it. But is that a sustainable and is that a healthy way to live?
No, and I think you said it. It's not sustainable for most people. And the conversation that we were having earlier before we started rolling was, think about the people and what they're eating prior to going on a carnivore diet. They're probably eating refined carbohydrates, perhaps a lot of sugar, perhaps a lot of bread, a lot of pasta, maybe pizza.
Right.
And our bodies aren't really designed that way. You talk about the Mediterranean diet. There's been more research around the Mediterranean diet and several blue zones where we see longevity.
Yep.
But you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Should we be eating a all animal diet because technically our stomachs are acidic and we shouldn't be eating vegetables and we do better? But the reality is that's not really true.
Well, and there's the people that are on the carnivore, the carnivore rant, I guess, if you will, are very against lectins and, plants, and these lectins and plants are toxic to our bodies, et cetera, et cetera. But I know you've got a lot to say about that too.
Yeah, I almost got apoplectic.
I saw that.
Did you see that?
I could feel it.
I mean, think about South America. If you took out lectins, beans, out of the diet of the Central and South America, what would they eat?
Yeah.
And maybe they're not blue zones, but at the end of the day, if you look at the research, especially think about Price Pottinger and Institute, where you had people learning how to soak their beans, and by doing so, you reduce the lectin content.
Right.
You're pre-digesting them, just like sourdough bread, where you're using healthy yeast to break things down, that the body then can respond in kind. But just eating animal food and not eating plants because you think that is better for you for the long run, because we were more designed that way, because we have the teeth for it and we have the stomach acid for it. It doesn't make sense. Where are we going to get fiber to move our bowels? Where are we going to get fiber to make short chain fatty acids, which help to feed the gut cells, the gut microbiome, and then help to fuel the brain?
Right.
And so I would say, for me, paleo, carnivore, all of these meat-centric diets, they also increase TMAO.
Yeah.
TMAO is a byproduct of breaking down.
I'm trying in my mind thinking of some sort of acronym. Too much. No,
right. No, that's good, right? Trimethylene oxide. And it's really just a byproduct of bacteria breaking down carnitine and a few other amino acids. And the breakdown of that produces TMA, and then you finally get TMAO, but it's a blood marker. So if you're looking at cardiovascular disease and you're saying, right, and remember Dean Ornish way back in the day, he was like 10% of the diet should be fat, and that is it. We should be plant-based, and people were doing well, and you saw less oxidized fat, less high cholesterol. So I don't know, going back to that conversation you said about why would somebody lose 10 pounds and somebody gain 10 pounds?
On the same way of
phenotype.
Yeah.
Some people are literally, so the phenotype faces the world, the genotype is what you're made up of.
Right.
And if your phenotype is made up of dysregulated blood sugar, dysregulated cholesterol, you maybe need to be more vegan. I also I've been reading a lot about the blood type diet, and I think some of that has a little bit of interest
that was real
to it.
Trendy for a while.
Because if you look at people who are type O, they always seem to tend more towards being animal focused
and B
versus
too.
B versus like type A's and
more of it, which I lean more towards a Mediterranean. I feel the best when I eat that way.
Right.
If I sat down and ate, my husband's a B type, so if I sat down and ate the same amount of steak as he did, I would be sick for days. And if he sat and ate as much broccoli as I like to eat, he'd be like, so there is something to be said for that. But from a nutrition standpoint, I just wonder if those kinds of diets are good for the long term. Now, I think, Paul Saldino, he's a big, obviously, carnivore MD. He's got he quotes a lot of great data, but he also does promote eating raw honey, raw butter, fruits, things like that. So he's not fully carnivore. And I think there's got to be some intuitive thinking around that, don't you think?
I do. And I think it's confusing for the general public.
It's very confusing.
And I think that you and I can sit here, we can have a conversation, and we know what we're talking about. We can jump from paleo to carnivore to Mediterranean. We know where the research is. But at the same time, if you look at the people who are influenced the most by diet and the ones that are really influenced by the quote standard American diet.
Yeah. That's SAD is the acronym.
Yep. The standard American diet is what's making people sick, largely because we're eating chemicals.
Right.
So you take those people, you put them on a higher protein, better fat diet where there is some plant foods, but maybe we're not crunching on salads the size of Mount Rushmore or eating 10 tons of kale a day, because should we be doing that either?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I think really the average and where I've been seeing the trend in the last 30 years that I've been in this business is 5 to 7 servings of vegetables a day. But if you think about how much a serving is, it's a half a cup, Terri.
Right. Yeah, it's not that much.
It's not that much.
Not that much. And what about so that's carnivore, and I agree with you. Like the thing, we were just talking about this previously, but you hear people, I started the carnivore diet and I lost 20 pounds. Well, how were you eating before? Anything you could have probably gotten those results anyway if you start eating, a little bit differently. So the carnivore diet is essentially all mostly animal based, but if you follow some proponents, they have some other fruits in there and things like that. And then paleo, let's talk about paleo, because that's a whole nother, I think paleo lifestyle makes some sense, right? But let's talk about where that term came from and how we lived as paleo creatures back in the day. It's not how we live now.
No, Paleolithic man, they probably were carrying around a staff of some sort in animal skins, barefoot, and they, maybe lived 20 years.
Yeah.
Died. But they would eat, they would hunt, the men would hunt, the women would get the wood,
forage.
and the women would forage, but they as a tribe, they would eat an animal, and they would take every part of that animal, nose to tail, and use it. But then when they began to run out of that animal, there was nothing left to eat. So they had to start going into the forage mode. But during that forage mode, they were in a state of stress, which is actually something called hormesis, where the physical body actually is more keto. Right? So that you have blood sugars down, your insulin is more sensitive at the cell, your body is using fat as a source of fuel.
Right.
So that quote hermetic response, or that tiny bit of stress, and you can apply that to like doing saunas or cold plunges.
Well, even kind of intermittent fasting.
Intermittent fasting, exactly. And I think if we really think historically, how many of us are going to go out and forage? I think the biggest thing about this, and I think you brought up a really good point, is that we're eating too much, too frequently.
Yep.
And when we do eat, we're eating toxic food if we eat the standard American diet. So paleo comes from, let's not eat the standard American diet. Let's go back to what we used to eat, which didn't have chemicals, which didn't have refined foods, and they were not agrarians.
Right.
So they were not growing grain. They were not eating wheat, making bread. And, I guess...
Well, actually, I did read a study that they were eating einkorn grain.
They were eating.
And they would carry the kernels in their pockets and eat them. It wasn't ground down like, we know wheat today to bake bread and things, but they did eat the grain, and the grain is what sustained them in times where they didn't have a saber-toothed tiger to feed the tribe. It's actually pretty interesting. And the other thing too is, I had another patient one time, she said, I've been doing this paleo thing and I'm kind of gaining weight. I don't understand it, because you can eat berries and you can eat this and you can eat that. And I said, well, and then this is kind of funny. She said, then I was watching a Discovery Channel Channel show on bears foraging and how bears fatten up for the winter, and they eat berries all summer. And I thought, maybe I'm eating too many berries. And, I started thinking, well, of course, in paleo times, they had to physically go out and forage for berries, not go to our refrigerator and open and eat a pint of berries. That's not how that worked.
Right.
And the berries they did forage, they shared with their whole family. So
Yes.
we're taking these concepts way out of context, I believe.
I agree.
And the other one I want to talk about is, I'm not a big fan of a pure vegan diet either, with no meats, for a lot of reasons, but I just want to know your thoughts on that from a dietitian perspective. And I know there's a lot of people that do vegan, but this is going to sound terrible, but I haven't really met a really healthy, fit vegan.
No.
So let's talk about that. Are you looking for a healthcare provider who understands the importance of integrative medicine? Evexias Health Solutions is changing the way we approach wellness. We train practitioners on cutting-edge therapies focusing on a preventative care model. If you're ready to take a proactive approach to your health, Evexias can help you find a provider who's right for you. Just head to Evexias.com, that's EVEXIAS.com, and click on the button Find a Provider to find a provider near you.
So I'm really glad that you brought this up, because for me, I don't think it is right, especially for children.
Yeah.
So I understand people have a philosophical idea about why they don't want to eat animals,
Right.
because they feel for the animals and the way we process animals in this country,
Sure.
whether it's the chickens or the beef, unless you're getting grass-fed,
I don't disagree
grass-finished.
with that. Yeah.
And they're stressed out and they cut off their beaks and they do all this stuff. It is kind of sad, but at the same time, we need the nutrients from animal protein that we don't get necessarily from
Plants.
protein.
Well, what about the
Heme,
argument?
iron.
What about the argument that there are certain food sources that are not animal based that have complete proteins, and that you can?
Yeah, so they say mixing beans with rice, you can get all of the 20 amino acids, or eating an egg. Well, even vegans don't eat eggs. So,
Yeah.
I typically find vegans to be B12 deficient, iron deficient. I find them to be, maybe they have more calcium, but potentially not magnesium.
Right.
Think about, are they eating enough to get the fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K?
Correct.
Because where are you getting those?
And where are you getting your fat from too?
Right.
Plus, I guess you're using avocado oil or olive oil or some of those oils. I guess that's true too.
And a lot of people think that veganism means that they maintain a healthy heart, right? Lower cholesterol. But the problem is that they eat more carbohydrate.
That's right.
Carbohydrate drives sugar, right? Insulin. Insulin is a fat storage hormone and a transport protein. So if it can't get the sugar into the cell, the carbohydrate, it's going to go to the liver and it's going to make a triglyceride and it's going to get stored as fat.
Well, that's what I was saying. I think that a lot of patients that I've interacted with that were vegan tended to have more symptomatology with brain fog and memory and just feeling fatigued all the time and things like that than people that had a different type of a diet. And I wonder sometimes if they're obviously lacking in some sort of nutrient. And you brought up a great point, and I think this is where if turning the tide a little bit with this MAHA movement and what's going on in the food industry for the sake of mass production, then what are we doing to the animals? What are we doing with our wheat? We can have a whole conversation about hybridized wheat, and I think we should. But I want to kind of stay on this topic first of the different lifestyles. Vegan is not the same as vegetarian.
Nope.
So vegetarian, all vegetables, any grains? Like, what is a typical vegetarian diet?
So vegetarians are basically eating plant foods, and then you have your lacto-ovo vegetarian, which is your vegetarian that eats dairy and eggs.
Okay.
Or your non-lacto-ovo, which don't.
Yeah.
But they might eat fish.
Okay.
So you
Then
might
there's
have
a pescatarian.
Yes, there's a pescatarian, which is, and then there's have you heard of the breatharians, where you just breathe?
Oh my goodness, no.
And that's it. No, vegetarians maybe more so, but Jim Lavelle calls it that plant-forward diet.
Yeah.
I think he's right, because what he's trying to say there is we need to eat plants. Think about the China study, where it really is showing long-term, and that's an old study, right? It's been around, what was that, like 30 years ago? But if you think about the China study, they really focused on people who ate less meat were healthier no matter what. And so if you think the blue zones, let's talk Sardinia, let's talk Okinawa, somewhere in Costa Rica, I think it is. I would think that they're eating plant-forward.
They're plant-forward, and they eat more fish. They eat more, things
omega
from the sea,
3 fats.
omega-3 fats.
Yeah.
And if they do eat some meats, they're less often, during the week, maybe once a week or something like that, which kind of leads you to the Mediterranean diet, where most blue zones are in Mediterranean areas. So let's talk about blue zones. What does that mean? First of all, and then what is that Mediterranean diet, which all the research I've read, everything points to Mediterranean. If you stack up paleo, carnivore, vegetarian, vegan, and Mediterranean's going to win every time.
It is.
So let's talk about that.
And you forgot Mark Hyman's Pegan, by the way.
Oh, what's Pegan?
Paleo-vegan.
Oh, paleo-vegan. Okay, wait a minute. Now, how does that work? Paleo-vegan, so just no meat.
Well, and if you're an ectomorph, like he is, tall and thin, versus the mesomorph versus the endomorph, which is the shorter and stockier, he could do whatever he wants and he'd still stay that way.
Right. That's true.
The Pegan is really plant-forward paleo.
Okay.
Without a lot of very little dairy. Very, very little dairy, and some pulses, some lentils, some beans, and things like that.
There's really, to me, what's interesting is there's a little truth to each one of them.
There is.
You know what I mean? And if you funnel all the truths of each of one of them, they kind of funnel to the Mediterranean diet.
They do.
So,
and if we could show what the Mediterranean pyramid looks like,
which we'll pull that up on the screen.
That'd be great. And there's a couple of different copies, but if I can, I'll get you the right copy. But the bottom layer is people eating together.
Yes.
And then it's
community.
Yes. And then it's grains. It's actually wheat. And then it's vegetables. And then there's a little bit of dairy. There's a little bit of
wine's in there too.
Fish, wine's in there too. And then
so
meat and sweets are at the top.
Yeah,
red meat and sweets are at the top.
Triangle. Yeah.
So if they eat a steak, Florentine steak, which is a very famous thing in Italy, if they eat a steak, it's not every night.
Right. And the cows are treated a little differently.
And the cows are treated differently.
Yeah, when we were in Italy, they had these big white cows, but they were just grazing and roaming in the fields.
And they're happy.
They're happy cows, and happy cows make happy meat.
Right. So when you go to slaughter them, they're not.
Yeah. So blue zones. So what is a blue zone? What does that mean?
So the blue zones really is a cluster of areas in the world where people have longevity, but they don't just live long, so they're not centenarians, people living to 100 and beyond. They're living long well.
Right.
So they're not, many people live long in the United States, but they are not ambulatory necessarily, and they might be in nursing homes, right? They might not be as cognizant as they need to be. So these are people who are living long, living well, and they equate it to a few things: diet, attitude, sense of humor, and even drinking alcohol versus not drinking alcohol. Because if you look at Italians, they drink red wine every day, but the Okinawans might drink rice wine or sake, right? So it's really, and I think there is a common denominator. The common denominator is plant foods.
Right. That's right.
There's a purple potato, I think, in Japan.
That's right.
That has this, these plant compounds, phenols and flavonoids, and all of these special antioxidants that support health. So I would say when you eat a plant-forward diet, which technically really is the Mediterranean and the blue zones, you're getting all of those micronutrients, your vitamins and minerals. You're getting all of those antioxidants.
Omegas.
You're eating that community. You're getting omega-3s, and you're not eating a lot of red meat.
It's the least on the pyramid. The other thing too that was interesting, there's a book I read called Ikigai or something like that. I'll leave it it's really interesting. So they studied all the blue zones, and the three things they saw in common was in all of the blue zones, in the people that lived to 100 or beyond and lived well, to your point,
right,
is number one, they moved their bodies every day.
Yes.
Number two, they didn't eat any processed foods because they just don't have processed foods in the blue zones. It's all seasonal. It's what's available. It's fresh, primarily plant forward and then fish based, but with some meats. They all drank some sort of green tea or high polyphenol concentrated liquid every day. And then they all had a purpose. That was the number one thing that they found. Besides, they moved their bodies and what they put in their bodies, but they had a purpose. Even if that purpose was the 85-year-old who got up and was a crossing guard at the local elementary school every day. They got up and they had a purpose. They walked every day. They gardened. They did something. And that's what kind of happens here in our country. And they all had community. Yes. They had meals with family. They were never alone. And when you hear this descriptor of where people are living longer, but not just living longer, we're living long in the United States. We're just not living well.
No.
Look at an 85-year-old in Sardinia and an 85-year-old in the States, the average. That's two totally different people. One of them is, probably very overweight on 25 medications and doesn't really get much up out of the recliner.
Right.
Whereas the other one is completely opposite. So these are things when we're talking about making America healthy again that we've really got to focus on. And I think, taking all the trends aside and the opinions of the social media influencers, at the end of the day,
which is dangerous.
It's so dangerous. It's so dangerous. The one you showed me about the lady that looks like a Viking that is anti-plants, it's kind of wild to me that this person is saying the things that they're saying without a lot of evidence but backing up what they're saying. But at any rate, it doesn't matter. Let's think intuitively, not only when we're going to places like Steak and Shake that are touting beef tallow, let's say, well, are those real potatoes or, are they manufactured potatoes? But eat a rainbow, eat intuitively. And
yes.
I think that is one of the biggest things that people are missing. We're following all these trends. And then the marketing kills me. Pretty much if you have to open it in a package, I don't care how healthy it says, unless it's Revival Einkorn crackers. Now,
right.
Those are pretty good. And
I haven't tried those.
Yeah,
I hope you have some here.
The link.
Oh my goodness.
That's totally different. But know what you're eating. And the last thing I want to touch on in the last few minutes that we have is speaking of einkorn, and we've talked a lot about gut health in other shows. We just were talking about Mediterranean, which is grain. Now the reason I want to end on this note is grains in the Mediterranean are very different than grains we get here. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about hybridization and what has happened to our wheat products, mostly in this country, but really in some other developed countries too. They're using a lot of hybridized grains as well. Now, ancient grains are making a comeback, thankfully. Einkorn was almost extinct, but it's made a comeback, and there's people that have recognized this as a really important grain. But if we're recommending the Mediterranean diet that has heavy grain as the big base of the food pyramid, let's educate the listeners on grains.
So the einkorn wheat is not a hybridized wheat. So I think people get confused. Genetically modified is when they take a gene from one thing and a completely different thing and put them together so that that particular plant will resist pests.
Correct.
Hybridization means that they are potentially trying to grow create more from a crop, from a single crop. So they began hybridizing wheat 50, 60, 70 years ago to take a stalk of wheat that used to grow very, very tall to a stalk that would produce more wheat in the shaft, but grow more quickly and shorter, so that they could, when they were going to farm that and get that wheat and grain, they could do it faster, get more of it to feed more people, because typically what people did with the grain,
husk is weaker.
Yes, right. The husk is weaker. And so but the main thing about hybridization is that it creates more strains of gluten that we've not been able to adapt to over the years.
Correct.
So yes, gluten is part of wheat, and it's not a problem for most people, but here's where the sticky wicket comes in. In the United States of America, we spray wheat after it's been harvested with glyphosate in order to reduce something called ergot, which is a fungus that grows on the wheat. And that fungus can actually cause you to have hallucinations, and it's not tasty to eat and not technically very healthy. So because of that, the glyphosate, what it does is it actually kills a pathway inside the fungus called the shikimate pathway, and it kills that pathway so that they can't produce phenylalanine and a couple different other amino acids, so that fungus can continue to grow.
Right, so that it can't grow. Right.
Right. So what it does to us is it's not necessarily hurting us, it's hurting our gut microbiome.
Yeah, right.
That at least is the theory.
Which hurts us in the long run.
Yes.
But here's what's interesting about that. So we have these ancient grains like einkorn, and then there's cousins that are spelt and some other cousins. But far as we can tell right now, einkorn is the only one that hasn't been hasn't been hybridized.
Nope.
And the reason they were hybridizing is for mass production, because we have a growing world, and the theory was we need to be able to grow more grain to feed this growing population globally.
Yes.
So, but the trade-off was einkorn was pest resistant, fungus resistant, and had all the proteins that we needed. It also was drought resistant, is drought resistant.
I actually didn't even know that.
Because it has really deep roots that go really deep into the ground, and it searches for water. Modern wheat has very shallow roots, so we've got to keep watering it, so we're using that resource. And to your point, because our modern wheat is not pest resistant, we're spraying it with all of these pests. So we took something that was perfect, that God had already made perfect, and in the name of feeding the masses or profits, we changed something that has caused a whole other set of issues. So the moral to the story is, and gluten is not a bad thing. Gluten has become a bad word.
Right.
And gluten is actually really important. And if you I've been super into sourdough making, and my husband makes really a lot of fun of me, but it's been great. And I only use einkorn now. But when you watch all these videos, and I've watched about 50 YouTube videos on making sourdough bread, but you're wanting to see the sticky, stretchy gluten.
Yes.
But it needs to be the right kind. And so I think we could have a whole nother conversation about, gluten and how it's, but modern wheat is what this kernel has, all of these different aspects of the kernel that ancient grains don't have, and that's what we're reacting to. We're reacting to that hybridization. So when people are choosing, if they want to try to have a healthy alternative, if you go from the SAD diet, Standard American Diet, which is the acronym is SAD, to a Mediterranean diet and you eat our terrible wheat, you're doing better, right?
You technically, yes, because you're not eating all of the bad food.
Yes. But if I'm really wanting to, and technically, if I want to be extra healthy with my bread, I could make a sourdough bread even with modern wheat, and that's even going to be better.
It is.
Because it's pre-breaking down and pre-digesting.
As long as it doesn't have bromate and it doesn't have...
bromide, halides, that's a whole nother conversation. So if I was going to try to buy commercially prepared healthier grains, what would I look for?
That's a good question, and I want to...
Since we're talking Mediterranean.
I think that's really good, because I think that'll help the listeners really say, what should we do? To your point, I also do it by einkorn. I have the book, I make the crackers, I make the sourdough bread. I don't eat a lot of it, but I do make it. But if you're going to buy regular wheat in America, at least it should be organic. Mm-hmm. But even organic wheat is, even if it's a farm down the street from another farm, it might still end up having some glyphosate in it, but it will be less.
Yeah.
So at least organic. You can purchase einkorn or semolina from Italy, right? You can even find those at Whole Foods, or of course gluten-free. It's just not the same.
Yeah. No, that's another.
Buckwheat.
Buckwheat
is not wheat.
I was hoping you'd say that.
Buckwheat is good, and it is full of nutrients, and you can make it into cereal.
There's buckwheat pancake mixes. There's buckwheat breads.
Delicious.
There's spelt breads.
Yep, spelt teff.
Yeah, and the best place, if I'm going to buy a commercially prepared bread, I'm buying it from the freezer, right? With Ezekiel brands are really good because they have full grains and they're organic, and they have spelt, and they have all kinds of different really great. And Ezekiel breads, before I started making my own, that was the only bread I could eat that didn't make me feel kind of sick and bloated and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But also on the grain side, you've got farro.
Yes.
You've got all kinds of, you can go down to your rice aisle and see all kinds of different types of grains that are quinoa, millet. There's we've been buying a lot from Central Market, these grain blends that have lentils and farro, einkorn and things like that. And those have so many health benefits. So I think it just takes a little bit of creativity. If you are going to get into grains, just be wise in what you're choosing. But like I said, even if you're just going to eat the normal American grain, you're doing better than the processed standard American diet.
And you can soak it overnight. And there's a cookbook out there by Sally Fallon, who is one of the Price Pottinger people. It's a terrific cookbook. It's called Nourishing Traditions, and she teaches you how to soak.
Yeah.
And then once you do that, and I've made many of her recipes, and they're really tasty. And I just want to bring up one thing about the beef tallow. I think we get into this novelty conversation, and we think, let's all start eating beef tallow. But frying anything at the end of the day is not healthy for us.
Right.
But we never throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's okay to have a potato chip fried in beef tallow once in a while, and to have French fries, real potatoes, cooked in duck fat or beef tallow.
Yeah.
It's just we don't want all the chemicals.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's really every conversation we have comes down to the fact that our food is poisoned. So if we can just try to eat everything in the perimeter of the aisles, cut down a little bit on red meat, we're better off.
We're better off.
Make our own sourdough bread.
Yeah. Shop on the outside of the grocery store as much as possible. Thanks again. It's always fun. We've got more to talk about, but for this show, we'll wrap it up, and hopefully we gave our listeners some good tips and tidbits. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Terri.